It isn't often that I remember a specific interpretation of a historical figure from one of my high school history textbooks, but I distinctly recall Frederick II the Great being introduced as someone who was an eccentric. He was possibly gay and also was effectively, for lack of a better term, a nerd, an Enlightenment philosopher in a time when most people were not actually interested in that. And his father was angry with him because his father was of more of a military bent. So my thinking was this must imply that Frederick William I, the father of Frederick the Great, was a really boring, staid, uninteresting guy, and that Frederick was the sort of outlier, the weird guy, the person who would be of interest not just for his accomplishments but also his personality. So I read up a little bit on Frederick William I, and what I found is that he was actually quite accomplished as a king. He was one of the best state builders in Prussian history, and he was also completely and utterly insane. So in this video, I want to go through all of the interesting aspects of Frederick William's personality and political career. I don't plan to provide anything like a complete history of either Prussia or the Hohenzollern dynasty, since those topics are covered elsewhere. However, I would like to talk about all of the important things that happened in the lifetime of Frederick William prior to his taking power in 1713. The important year here is 1688, which happens to be the year that Frederick William I was born. That same year, his grandfather, Frederick William, the Great Elector, died. It was largely the work of the Great Elector which made Prussia a viable enough political entity that Frederick William I's father, Frederick I, was able to declare himself king. The titles that the Great Elector and Frederick I had held were those of Duke of Prussia and Elector of Brandenburg, but in 1701 Frederick I felt sufficiently established in his authority to declare himself king in Prussia. And yes, it is king in Prussia, not king of Prussia. Frederick I was a pleasure-seeking man who enjoyed luxury, and that sort of fits with someone who would have himself declared king and more or less invent a monarchy where none had previously existed. Part of his public image was that he liked to be seen as luxurious, so he would collect things like jewels and nice horses and fancy furniture. So this way he could show off his new status by living a super aristocratic lifestyle which went beyond the financial means of your normal baron or duke or what have you. However, Frederick William would prove to have a much different temperament and have different ambitions than his father had. By 1713, when he took power early in the year, Frederick William had become a severe man who was an ardent Calvinist and a confirmed militarist who hated all pacifist Christian groups. And so from that description, you might think that Frederick William would be a warmonger similar to someone like his son or Napoleon, but that simply isn't the case, as we'll see. Frederick William I is far more complicated than all of that. In 1706, at the age of 18, Frederick William married his first cousin Sophia Dorothea of Hanover, who was a daughter of George I, King of England. This was a pretty good match for him, as obviously anyone who's the daughter of a foreign monarch is a desirable marriage partner. And what this does is it really legitimates the throne that he is going to inherit from his father, because effectively George I has recognized Frederick I as a legitimate member of the European monarchy. So this is the sign for the Hohenzollerns that they have indeed arrived. Now granted, George I was not quite as prestigious as some of the other monarchs in Europe, but he is still a monarch of a known power. This couple would be quite prolific in their child making, with 14 total children. I think 4 of them died in childbirth and the other 10 were able to make it to adulthood to some extent. And of this batch of children, the oldest surviving boy was Frederick II, and therefore he would be designated as the heir from a relatively early time, and I believe that he was already alive by the time that Frederick William took the throne. This marriage between Frederick William and Sophia Dorothea was not a happy one, perhaps because they couldn't agree on who was able to carry out two names better. Frederick William was physically and verbally abusive, and we have many anecdotes of that. He engaged in a lot of child abuse and almost certainly in some spousal abuse as well. When there would be marital spats, it appears that the children got entangled in those, and when Frederick William would have a feud with one of his children, his wife would usually side with the child and involve herself in that as well. So this was a family drama that was deeply unhappy and dysfunctional. One of the things that we know that Frederick William and Sophia Dorothea fought over is that Sophia wanted her children to marry into the royal family of England and get those connections back and keep that line open with her homeland, or at least the homeland of her family. She herself was more German. But Frederick William had no interest in that, and he instead wanted to marry more locally for the more tactical advantage closer to home. So this was a major point of feuding between husband and wife, and also between Frederick William and his son Frederick II. Just to recapitulate where Frederick William stood in the world when he came to power in 1713, he was 24 years old, hardworking, and quite ready for this task. He took the titles of King in Prussia, Elector of Brandenburg, and Prince of Neuchatel, the other title that his father had claimed. Prussia was a minor or regional power at this point, but it had been rising steadily in power, and I suppose it is what you could call a blue chip country, or a blue chip kingdom in this case. It had territories that were strong all over, and its monarchs dreamt of uniting those territories and creating a much larger and more powerful kingdom that could rival places like Austria or Russia. Now, this was a pipe dream at this point, but of all of the smaller states that could dream of growing into larger ones, Prussia was one of the more promising prospects by quite a bit. Frederick William I would quickly establish himself as a capable governor and administrator. However, his governing style was very much that of a micromanager. As an absolute monarch, what he tried to do is both set the tone in his personal behavior and also check in on his officials constantly to make sure that they're following every rule and regulation. As we'll see, he was a very strict drill master in the literal sense on the drill field, and he would apply that same mentality of a drill sergeant to literally everything that he did. Much, I'm sure, to the displeasure of everyone who had to associate with him. The first act, or one of his first acts as king, was to show his personal austerity by selling off most of his father's furniture, jewelry, and unused fancy horses. He did this largely to send a message to the Prussian nobility that he expected them to comport themselves as serious men and soldiers. He thought that it was the destiny of Prussia to be a nation of warriors. He also dictated the entirety of the Manual of Regulations for State Officials, and this is a work which lays out the specific duties of every public office in Prussia. Some of the penalties in this are quite strict, and they're reminiscent of military punishments. Frederick William tried to run everything like an army. Any minister who failed to attend a committee meeting could lose 6 months' pay, but if he happened to miss a second time, he would then be simply dismissed from service. And that is a pretty harsh penalty if you're someone who depends on a salary. But the thing is that even though Frederick William was a little more open than a lot of his predecessors to people who were not from the titled nobility, for the most part he wanted all of his senior officials and generals to be people from the titled nobility. So if they lost 6 months' pay, that was irrelevant to them since they didn't need that pay to survive. And if they were dismissed from service, well, they were still noblemen, so it wasn't actually that damning for them. The point is that while this sounds really harsh, and it was, you can't think about it in modern terms because the people who would lose 6 months' pay, for the most part, would not really feel the pinch of that punishment. It would be more of an insult and a way to try to correct their behavior in the future. It should come as no surprise that the micromanager Frederick William more or less transformed Prussian civil government during his 27-year reign. He closely supervised every aspect of the government and made sure that it ran to his specifications. And in addition to merely managing the bureaucracy such as it was very small, he also had some initiatives that he undertook which had a major impact on the way that Prussians lived their lives. One of his initiatives was to clear marshland to encourage more farming, the idea being that Prussia was undersettled and that this made him weak since this affected his revenue and also his manpower pool. By reclaiming marshlands and expanding his farms, he allowed for population growth. In good times, the Prussian government under Frederick William would store grain and then sell it during shortages. This was a form of price control, and it is something of a management tactic to make sure that famines don't occur. This was not necessarily common during this period. Governments tended to not be very interventionist when it came to preventing things like famines. So Frederick William was actually quite advanced, or I suppose you could even say ancient in this way. The Romans did similar things. At any rate, though, he clearly took an active role in government and made sure that it worked in what he perceived to be the national interest. By preventing famines, you increase stability, of course, and you work toward that long-term goal of having a major power. Also to that end, Frederick William established schools and hospitals. While he's mostly known for his military bent of mind, he also did understand that education and medical care were important, and that this would be part of what he would need ultimately if he was going to build Prussia into a real power. It had been standard before Frederick William to have all Prussians serve in the military as an obligation, but he instead replaced the mandatory military service among members of the middle class with an annual tax. And the idea here is that this gave him a reliable stream of revenue to finance his other projects. And these projects, of course, would be more important than having members of the relatively small middle class under arms. The amount of manpower that he would lose was more than offset by the revenue that they would generate. So this was actually all smart government. Despite being active in enhancing the scope of his civil government, Frederick William's main concerns were always military. His pet project was to increase the size of Prussia's standing army, and he was able to muster 89,000 men under arms by 1740. The population of Prussia at this time was not very large, and this military was proportionally almost certainly the largest in Europe outside of some of the little microstates which may have been able to maintain a slightly higher proportion. But what we see here is that Frederick William had more or less maxed out the size of an army that his territory could possibly support. Of this total, around 40,000 of Frederick William's men were of foreign origin. So partly he was not depending on local conscripts. This is why he was able to allow middle-class people to not serve, but he was willing to work with any and all soldiers who were available. Of these foreign troops who served in the Prussian army, the majority of them were Polish, so they came from just to the east of his core territories. Frederick William was known for drilling his army extensively and teaching it to move very precisely. This is something that he was deeply obsessed over, and he thought that war was all about precision and discipline. His son, Frederick II, would later use a similar model of how to train an army, but Frederick II would focus a great deal more on speed, whereas Frederick William was not really concerned with speed, but rather just precision and the look and the pageantry of the whole thing. Despite Frederick William's attention and the massive expenditures that he put toward military matters, Frederick William's Prussia only participated in one war during his entire 27-year reign. And as we'll see, from the Prussian perspective, this was not much of a war. The Great Northern War between Sweden and an alliance led by Russia had been going on since about 1700, and For Frederick William, this war was hardly news. It had been going on for basically his entire adult life by the time he took power. His father had been unwilling to engage in the war, but foreign princes thought that perhaps Frederick William, who was a well-known aficionado of all things military, might want to try it out. He did eventually join the anti-Swedish alliance at a time when Sweden was losing and when all of his neighbors were in the anti-Swedish alliance. His reason for joining was to secure more territory. In exchange for lending his troops to the alliance, he was granted control of the estuary of the river Oder. And this effectively would give his core areas in Brandenburg and Prussia access to the Baltic Sea, something that Prussia had been trying to achieve for centuries, but that was only now made a reality. And while Frederick William did have one of the best drilled and organized armies in Europe, from what I can gather, the Prussian involvement in the war was more or less just marching to the estuary of the river Oder, claiming it, and then signing a piece of paper to make it official that they now owned the land. Sweden was massively overextended, and Frederick William joined at exactly the right moment to capitalize on Swedish weakness. So this was a fairly major territorial addition, even if it doesn't appear all that impressive on the map. However, while Frederick William I had some enviable achievements and clearly had some positive qualities as a ruler, there were some darker sides to his personality and his career. Perhaps the oddest thing about Frederick William I, and the thing that induced me to make this video, is the institution of the Potsdam Giants. Prussia had founded this unit back in 1675. This was one regiment where all of the men were, quote, giants. A giant by the standard of this regiment was someone who in American terms would be 6'2" or taller. In Prussian terms that would be 6 feet even. And this unit was something of a novelty, the idea being that these guys would be more intimidating on the battlefield, and if they're standing around the palace they look important and imposing and whatnot. This unit had a number of nicknames. Potsdam Giants is the most commonly used one, but they're also called the Great Grenadiers, the Big Prussian Blues, and the local Prussian population in Berlin simply referred to them as the Tall Guys. From an early age, Frederick William was associated with this then new unit, and prior to his accession to the throne, when he was waiting for his father Frederick I to kick the bucket, he actually commanded this unit for a number of years. Over the time that he spent with this unit, Frederick William became completely and totally obsessed with the idea of having as many giants as humanly possible under his control. As ruler, while he would not spend money on luxuries like superfluous horses or furniture, he did spend mountains of cash trying to expand his Potsdam Giants regiment. These men, of course, would be much more expensive to maintain than average because of their higher caloric needs, and as we'll see, recruiting them was an absolute burden financially for Prussia. Just to underline exactly how obsessed Frederick William was with his Potsdam Giants, he was once quoted as saying, "He who sends me tall soldiers can do with me whatever he likes." And that more or less explained his foreign policy. He would side with people who would send him giants, whereas he apparently was not warm toward rulers who did not send him giants for his personal guard. Foreign rulers caught on pretty quickly, and they figured that sending a few giants to this crazy 5'3" king in Germany was worth the price of an alliance or a friendship. So they would effectively kidnap tall people in their own countries and ship them out to Prussia. Tsar Peter the Great was interested in getting Prussia involved in the Great Northern War, and part of the reason he was able to induce Frederick William I to break with his policy of neutrality is that he began sending annual shipments of tall men to Prussia in 1714, thus building their relationship and speaking to Frederick William in a language he could understand, the language of tall men. Frederick William visited King Augustus of Poland at one point, And he was so obsessed with the 24 giants that King Augustus had at his court and would pester him over and over about these men that the Polish king eventually just gave them to him as a gift so he'd stop asking. The British minister in Berlin reported that there was one man among the giants who was 7'6", so he recommended to George I that the best way to win over Prussian friendship and maintain it was to send tall men. Accordingly, George I of England decided to send 15 huge Irishmen a few months later. The Irish, of course, were the long exploited subjects of the British crown, and English officers could rule in Ireland as virtual dictators, so George did not abuse subjects that he cared about, but he did nonetheless sell out some of his subjects in order to win favor with Prussia. Far from being content with merely receiving men as gifts or buying them from foreign rulers, Frederick William actively, quote, recruited men from across Europe. He would offer generous pay and bounties to hundreds of agents who traveled around Europe looking for tall men. These recruiters would mostly either buy these men from others or simply kidnap them and then transport them back to Prussia, often at great expense and great risk. Many of these recruiters were killed in the line of duty, either by local authorities or by the men they were trying to abduct. Remember, if you're trying to abduct 7-footers, they can be pretty strong. That's something that is not unknown for very tall people. And you would think that this would be enough of a deterrent, but the pay was good enough from Frederick William that there were always men willing to take the risk and engage in human trafficking of giants. And therefore, throughout the entirety of Frederick William's reign, he was able to have a steady pool of recruits for his pet unit. Although apparently it seems that the peak of his unit was around 1731 or 32, but at any rate, he was never hurting for giants, and he always had a steady supply. As you might imagine, bringing in a few thousand very large, strong men against their will and making them your pet soldiers is a dangerous proposition. Very few of the Potsdam Giants were there of their own volition. There were some who were Prussian and some who were grateful for the opportunity to make a living, but for the most part, a lot of the men were deeply discontent, or even the men who might have signed up voluntarily became discontent. Once you were enrolled in this unit, it was a capital offense to desert, and the only way out was in a very large box. This unit was therefore very hard to manage. Frederick William didn't make things any easier because he was a cruel and exacting drill master. He noticed every little detail of a drill from every person involved, and even minor deviations would be punished by quick strikes from his cane. He also enjoyed showing off and practicing his men so much that the men could be called upon to do drills at any time, day or night, or in any weather condition. Frederick William had no sympathy for people who couldn't tolerate the cold, as we'll learn. Suicides were common, and this of course necessitated more steady recruitment by all of the agents that he had, and this perhaps explains why he was so importunate with the King of Poland and others about the need to send him tall men. Needless to say also, since he is drilling these men so severely, a lot of people who are giants are not super coordinated, and this must have been absolute torture for some of the clumsier tall guys who were out there really suffering under the cane of their king. The real problem with the Potsdam Giants in terms of evaluating Frederick William as a ruler is that this unit was highly inefficient and contributed nothing to his national security. This unit, when it was at its highest ever strength of 3,030 men, cost as much to maintain as 8 ordinary infantry regiments recruited from normal-sized men who wanted to be there. Between 1712 and 1735, Prussia spent 8 million thalers for recruits alone. That does not include the cost of actually keeping the unit around or paying the men or whatever. This is just to recruit new people. Ostensibly soldiers, the Giants were really prisoners who had to be guarded themselves. This means that you also have to pay people to keep your supposed soldiers soldiering. That's not good. The Giants, because of their size and an age when it was hard to get a ton of nutrition when you were that size and you had those kind of caloric needs, tended to be less healthy than their more typically sized counterparts. This meant that a lot of these guys had to receive medical treatment and that they were often not fit for duty. Not to mention that as giants, they would have consumed more food. So that was also inefficient, since they weren't really providing more military service to go along with that. Frederick II knew that this unit was something of a novelty, so he reduced it back to its pre-Frederick William role when he took the throne. At first, he just let the unwilling giants leave the service, and then, after using them in his first crisis on the throne, he reduced the unit to a mere battalion, meaning it was maybe a third or a fourth the size that it had once been. And in this form, the Potsdam Giants survived until the Battle of Vienna in 1806, after which they were disbanded and having been completely revealed as a novelty that made no actual difference on the battlefield. In this regard, Frederick William I was kind of like the modern Department of Defense in America, which often spends on projects that don't quite pan out or have a hell of a lot of functionality. I think the key example of that being the F-117 Nighthawk, a supposed fighter which had literally no ability to defend itself if it was ever picked up on radar or spotted visually. So hardly a fighter, if you ask me. The only other thing that I remember learning about Frederick William and Frederick II in my high school history book is that effectively they had a father-son feud when Frederick was a teenager, because Frederick was interested in music, philosophy, and possibly also in men. And Frederick William had killed his potential lover and forced him into jail and done some other things, and had been a fractured relationship. The way that it was put in the textbook gave me the impression that Frederick William was an upholder of normalcy, I guess you could say, to borrow Harding's word. But in reality, having learned more about Frederick William, I'd have to say that Frederick II was quite normal by comparison. There weren't too many Enlightenment philosophers running around, but they are a known quantity. Frederick William I, however, with his Potsdam Giants, is really more of a Gaddafi-esque figure than someone who is a recognizable type. At any rate, the real beef between Frederick William and his son was their idea of what the interest of a ruler should be. Frederick William, the arch micromanager, thought that his son should limit his interest strictly to war and administration. He doesn't need to know anything else because nothing else applies to a king. Frederick, of course, was more broad-minded than that, and this infuriated his father to no end. If you can imagine it, I suppose Frederick William would become enraged if he knew that his son knew something that was, quote, irrelevant. Frederick William frequently cursed at or beat young Frederick, and once became so enraged that he tried to strangle him to death with a cord. How that did not end in the death of young Frederick II is unclear. Once Frederick wore gloves in the cold to protect his hands, and Frederick William beat him for being soft. Once a horse bolted while he was on it, and Frederick was thrown to the ground, and instead of helping his son up, Frederick William beat him. You begin to get the impression. Frederick William was the best father of all time, and Father's Day was largely instituted to honor the sacrifices that he made for his children. They all fondly remembered him forever and never had nightmares about his actions. So what is the overall legacy and significance of Frederick William I of Prussia? He was one of the key state builders of Prussia. He left his son Frederick II with a large, well-trained army and a government streamlined for making war. I would go so far as to say that without inheriting all of this from his father, Frederick II may not have been able to become Frederick the Great. The doubts that many European rulers had about the new Frederick II is to some extent a testimony to the ability and reputation of Frederick William. Frederick William built the base from which Frederick II built Prussia into an actual power on the broader European stage. It was never on the same level as, say, France or Britain, but it was the fifth player on the international stage, and that was a big step up from where it had been. Frederick William played a big role in that, and without the combined efforts of Frederick William and his son Frederick the Great, Prussia would not have been in a position to later unite Germany in the 19th century, since it may not have been the strongest player in the German area. Frederick the Great, despite obviously having a few reservations about his father due to his father being a crazy person who collected giants and beat him for basically no reason, did say that his father, quote, penetrated and understood great objectives and knew the best interest of his country better than any minister or general. Given that this praise comes from someone who vastly expanded Prussia and far exceeded the accomplishments of his father, that is still quite high praise, and I think that it shows that while Frederick William I was a monster in many ways, he's a human trafficker, a wife beater, a child abuser, he was also a quite intelligent statesman and someone who ended up having a large impact on history by so greatly advancing the ball for Prussia and, in effect, later Germany as well.